Welcome to the Medical Device Made Easy podcast. Here is Munir Lazouzi from easymedicaldevice.com. And today we'll talk about the UK. So there was some news on the UK. So we talked since a long time about some changes that will happen in the UK, new legislation that will be coming, new things. But instead of giving you a full legislation, they just took a small bit and say, okay, here is the first thing for you, which is the post-marketing surveillance. And I have with me Claire Dyson from DQS who will be talking about that. So hi, Claire. Welcome to the Medical Device Made Easy podcast.
Hello, Monia. Thank you for inviting me on to talk about PMS.
And so mainly we'll try to explain mainly what is happening in the UK. Is this changing completely our situation? Should people change completely their procedures or throw away all their templates, etc.? So let's discuss with you about that. But before that, can you make an introduction of yourself?
Absolutely. So my name's Claire Dyson. I'm currently the head of approved body for DQS. We are in application to become an approved body. But I've also been involved in the UK project really for 5 years, quite frontline, shall we say, involved in discussions with the new UKCA legislation. I say, if I say supporting the legislators, it sounds quite arrogant. I don't mean it like that. There's been a lot of dialogue, and I think that's one of the nice things about the UK and the new UK legislation is there is a lot of dialogue between the regulators and the approved bodies, which I think is going to be very helpful in the long term. But obviously, we're also mindful that the initial vision of what UKCA would be back in the days when Brexit was
Yeah.
just a thought process has changed enormously and will continue to change because the market has changed. We've been through COVID, we've been through other changes, obviously EU MDR. We're learning a lot of lessons from the EU MDR, and I think that we're also quite mindful that the UK market is evolving as well. So obviously legislation has to evolve with that.
Exactly, and I like that in comparison to, as I've said, what we are doing in Europe. It's like just we throw to you everything, and you have to apply it immediately or soon, etc. Here it's more like, oh, we had Brexit, so let's first do as usual, don't change anything. Then let's change a bit here, a bit there. Let's ask you also what you want, and then we can
Mhm.
have a consultation and discuss about it. So it's like really nice. English maybe in the English way, if I can say so. It's really
It
nice.
wasn't like that at the beginning. I
Yeah,
mean,
I
at the
mean.
first few years, it was really quite stressful because there were very hard political deadlines that wouldn't seem to be non-negotiable. And I think it was really a combined effort of manufacturers saying, we just can't do this.
Yeah.
And the notified bodies or the approved bodies saying, we can't be designated and transfer in these timelines that you're given. And I think now with the the lessons learned with implementing the EU MDR, the impact that's having on availability of medical devices, plus the structure of the medical device manufacturers in the EU, I think that the UK is being much more pragmatic. They're taking time to think about it and they're addressing the areas where we had, if I say the biggest gaps in legislation under the directive, it was PMS.
Yeah.
And that's why we're seeing that the PMS legislation is coming through first. So, there have been other changes in the UK legislation. So they have changed things around virtual manufacturers, which again was a safety gap that we knew under the directive. And there are other areas that are gradually changing to be brought. So if the EU MDR is there and the directives were there, the UK legislation is actually filling some of those gaps. PMS will be the big one. And I
Exactly.
think
Yeah.
what's interesting about the PMS legislation is it does open the door for the international reliance, which is now being discussed amongst multiple different jurisdictions. Obviously, we've seen lots of changes in the US over the last 6 months, and that international reliance is becoming very interesting to lots of different jurisdictions. And of course, international reliance plus PMS gives the regulators the visibility that they actually need to safeguard the public health without actually enforcing or insisting on a individual approval in that jurisdiction.
Yeah, exactly. And so PMS, the biggest gap. So what's I mean, in December, they announced here is the PMS, new PMS requirements for UK. Can you tell us more about this announcement and mainly what is there?
Yeah.
What was really, is it really a big bang change or it's no, just some small adjustment here?
So it started before December. That's when it was laid. The law was laid, and so we're in a 6-month transition period, and manufacturers have to comply by June this year. I think just to really stress one of the key misunderstandings that we're seeing from industry is a lot of manufacturers say, well, if I'm taking CE as a route to market to place product on the market in GB, I don't need this because this is just for UKCA. No, 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 no.
Okay.
It's not. There are laws that apply even if you're placing your product on the market under CE. And those requirements include, for example, registration with MHRA. All devices need to be registered, whether they're UKCA or CE, they need to be registered. If you're outside of GB, you need to have your UK responsible person do that registration and be appointed. And that applies, again, CE, UKCA, as does the PMS requirements. And so the advantage if you're using CE as route to market, under the EU MDR transition, you should have already started
Yeah.
to implement your PMS program. So it's a case of by June, making sure that your program is compliant with the UK requirements as well. If you're using UKCA as a route to market, this is an add-on that you've now got to get ready to do. And I think that, I'm looking at you here with UK responsible people. There is also a role to play there because as a UK responsible person, you will become responsible for providing that PMS report to MHRA if they call it in. And so the UKRPs are going to be asking for it and putting that extra pressure on manufacturers to make sure they're conforming to the timelines.
Unearth the pulse of the medtech world with MedTech Conf, a dynamic platform featuring global events on medical devices, biologicals, IVD, and pharmaceuticals. Stay informed, stay ahead, connect, share, and elevate your knowledge. Become an official sponsor. Make your event shine on the map. MedTech Conf, your key to the medtech universe. Remember, the future is now, and it's at your fingertips with MedTech Conf.
Exactly, and it's good. We are also at Easy Medical Device UK responsible person, so mainly we'll have to apply. I mean, to push pressure, as you've said, on some manufacturers. But
Yeah.
mainly, when you said that for CE marking and for UKCA, it will be the same kind of pressure. So for CE marking, if we are already following EU MDR, so will there be a lot of changes, or it's just a small gap also?
Well, I think it's quite a small gap, but then I'm looking at it from, having experience of doing PMS. I think if you are a manufacturer that doesn't have much experience in doing these things, it might seem much bigger.
Okay.
If you go back, and it's very typical of MHRA, because if you go back to the days where the good old days where the UK was part of the EU, if you look at the way that legislation changed and all the inputs that were put in, MHRA always provided, I would say, clarity around how you implement the new requirements. And in my mind, when I'm reading this new legislation, I'm seeing that clarity again. So what we're seeing is, compared to the EU MDR, we're seeing much more prescriptive detail. So around timelines, around content, around how things are presented. They've provided some templates as well, which just facilitate the process. I think for manufacturers who've got CE, there's a lot of alignment in what the requirements are. And I think there would be a temptation almost to say, well, then my CE is good enough, my CE PMS is good enough. But there are differences, and I think that's where potentially there's going to be sort of a few pitfalls. Now, we have an amazing team member at DQS, Sophia Prata, who's been involved in the Team AB program to provide manufacturers with guidance to analyse these new regulations, to harmonise with the approved bodies so that we're all approaching it in the same way. And she's produced a series of blogs, which I'll provide the links to.
Yeah.
And that's where you've really got the detail of what to look out for and, you know, the timelines and what data you need to include. As a sort of very high level, I think that firstly, obviously, everything starts with process. A manufacturer needs to update their QMS processes to make sure that they're actually covering the UK requirements, including reporting to MHRA, obviously. And then in the PMS, you've got to think how you're presenting that data, because obviously for the EU, you're looking at a jurisdiction, you're looking at a global reach. In the UK, you're looking at something different. There might be a bit of overlap, but MHRA are looking at slightly different data to EU. So that needs to be separated so that you're meeting both jurisdictions. Some manufacturers may be able to present it in as a combined report. In my mind, I feel it needs to be separated, but it's up to the manufacturers to decide how they would go about doing it.
I think for people maybe that are hearing that, it's really a bad news because they don't like that. Don't like to separate documents. They prefer to have one document that goes to every country and everybody likes it instead of you have to make separation. But yeah, as you mentioned.
So to be clear, Mania, I wouldn't separate the documents. It's separating the analysis.
Okay, so yeah, having an additional chapter maybe on UK specifically. Okay.
Yeah, and it's just calling out that data because, you know, when you're doing your PMS, you're looking at the data and, you know, the vigilance data, the other data you're collecting, and you're looking at it over a period of time. So I would, and you know, this is just me speaking loud.
Yeah.
If I could, I would align that data period as far as possible with CE so that you're doing one event because there is a lot of overlap. But then when you're presenting that data, you have to think, how can I present it to MHRA so they get what they need and the EU Commission so that they get what they need? And it's presenting that in those two formats. So straight away they can, your notified body, your approved body will be able to look at that and be able to find what they're looking at. Now, just one thing to mention, if you are just going via CE, and you don't have a UK approved body, so you're placing your product on the GB market under CE, it would be MHRA that are reviewing your PMS, not the body.
Yeah.
And I think that's quite an important thing to remember. Some people might see that as an advantage because they don't need to pay their approved body to do that one-day review. Some people might see that as a disadvantage because it's the regulator now that's looking directly at their data. So MHRA can call that at any time. So it sits with the UKRP or it sits with the manufacturer until that point where MHRA call it in. Now, either way, if you've got a approved body that's also your notified body, they can probably, if I say detangle, but they're experienced with your files, they're experienced with the way that you present your data. For them, it's probably easier to find what they're looking for, but of course they have their own requirements. If you're now sending that package over to MHRA and they're used to looking with their MHRA goggles on, so to speak, they need more guidance to be able to find exactly what they're looking for. And I think, you know, one thing I always say to manufacturers is you need to tell a story. You need to tell your story of your device. You need to tell me your story and why it's safe and why the performance is good enough to be accepted. Okay. Why we've got that benefit risk analysis that's positive. You need to be able to think about who your audience is when you're telling that story.
Agree, yeah. So in terms of a scope or impact, are we here talking about all medical devices that should follow that, or are there any exceptions? And we always have also this distinction between UK and Northern Ireland also. So this is the complex things that when we discuss it's like, oh, I don't remember what is in the context for Northern Ireland and now on all these things. So can you just enlighten her on on this?
Absolutely. So let's take Northern Ireland first. Northern Ireland it didn't exit the common market, so Northern Ireland still has CE. Okay. So anything that applies to CE applies to Northern Ireland, but their regulator is MHRA. So there's a sort of slight, you need to still register with MHRA. So regarding the application, so let's start by saying it applies to all devices, whether they're
Okay.
UKCA or CE, all devices, but there are exemptions. And the full exemptions are devices for clinical investigation,
Okay.
devices for performance evaluations, so that's your IVDs, any devices that are subject to an exceptional use authorization. So if you don't know what exceptional use authorization, MHRA will, for certain devices, particularly if it's humanitarian, sometimes if it's the Ministry of Defence, MHRA will allow a exceptional use authorization. They're not covered by this particular requirement, largely because it's very small numbers. For partial exemptions, it's largely around custom-made devices. And, again, custom-made devices are an area unto themselves. And again, it's because of the small numbers and each device is separate. So there are some partial exemptions there.
But apart from that, then everybody has to
All
follow it.
devices.
Everything has to go, even class 1M, class 1S, class 1R, etc. All those products,
Well,
everybody.
you're self-declared on those devices, yeah. So,
Okay.
and I think it's really important to state that, because I know I've said it, I'll say it again. If you're going via CE and you're placing your product on the GB market with CE, you still need to comply to the PMS requirements.
Exactly, yeah. So now that we hear what is the requirement, so what are you maybe saying now to manufacturers what they should do then to put their products into service to start maybe this process?
So it's like any change management, any good change management process. You start by sort of systematically gathering evidence, read the PMS legislation, read it now because you've got very little time to actually implement that change.
Because yeah, again, the change it's mandatory by the 16th of June 2025, correct?
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. So you'll really now need to be putting your processes in now so that you're gathering that data going forward. If you've already got CE, you've probably got quite a comprehensive PMS system because you're adapting to the EU MDR anyway. So now it's a case of slotting in those additional UK requirements. And as I said, Sophia's done a fantastic job on identifying all of those requirements so in our blog, so I won't go into the details here. It's important to make sure that your plan and your report templates meet both the EU and the UK requirements so that you're not duplicating documents. As I said at the beginning, you have to separate out the data, but
Yeah.
for most devices, you won't need to separate out the actual reports. There might be some exceptions to that, but it's particularly if you've got a different portfolio of devices or different models of device that are going on each market. You need to integrate it. Obviously, if you've got CE, you've probably already done this, but you need to integrate the technical documentation, the risk analysis, the clinical evaluation, the labeling. You've got to bring that all together. And then you need to think about, specifically for MHRA, there are additional requirements around the timeline, so that 3-day requirement to provide the documentation, but also around trend reporting and some of the other nuances of PMS. So I really encourage all manufacturers, if there's one thing you do in April, and we've not got much longer left of April, please read that document, do a gap analysis against your current procedures, start implementing those changes, procedure, and then it will trickle down into the reports so that when MHRA call that document, or your UKRP calls the document, or your UKAB calls the document, you're ready and you've got it already there.
So again, you said 3 days. What was those 3 days that we talked about, the timeline?
So MHRA can ask for you to provide the PMS report, and you have 3 days to produce
Okay,
it.
so it's really like that, 3 days, and it's
And so you've got to be ready. And I think that, PMS is a living document, so you've got to know how to update it. And I think it reminds me, this concept reminds me a little bit of the US FDA inspections.
Mm-hmm.
You never know when you're going to get a
Yeah.
US FDA inspection. And I know a lot of manufacturers sort of, that's why they've gone for MDSAP, because they want that predictability of knowing when they're going to get an audit. They want the relationship with the recognized auditing organization that's delivering the MDSAP. And in some respects, I look at this PMS from a manufacturer's viewpoint, and I can think, well, actually, I would almost want my approved body to be involved in this, so that at least I've had somebody look at it before it goes to MHRA. I've got a safety net before I go through. But
So
there's an additional cost involved in that, obviously.
exactly, yeah. So now we said mainly what manufacturers should do. As we said, we have maybe some UK rep that are responsible person that are listening now. What they should do then also.
So what should the UK rep do? Well, obviously you've got to receive the PSUR reports and retain them. And that's got to be with the other technical documentation. So
Yeah.
maybe just backtrack and we say, well, what is the UKRP's role? Obviously, your role is to register the devices, annually check that the registration is up to date, and retain technical documentation. And you should be doing your due diligence on checking that technical documentation when you receive it. Now you've got an additional role of checking that the PSUR reports have been received, adding that to the technical documentation, and then if MHRA were to request that information, you then have to provide it. So you've got to cooperate with MHRA to make sure that you're providing that information to them in a timely manner.
So in case, just maybe in case I ask the manufacturer to provide me that and it doesn't provide that to me, is it my responsibility? And if I can say I'm in fault, or it's the manufacturer's responsibility here?
It's a good question, and it's not something that I would say I'm very familiar with that situation. But what I would say is, you're at the UKRP, you have a contract with the manufacturer. They have to provide those documents. So if you had a non-cooperative manufacturer, you still have to do your due diligence, and that might mean that it's breach of contract.
Yeah. Okay.
So my recommendation to you as a UKRP is make sure it's in your contract.
Okay. So if actually now I have my PMS documentation, PSUR or plan, PMS plan, PMSUR plan, or things, and in the middle we have now this change about UK. So how do you see now this collaboration? I mean, this transition, if I can say, related to that. So should, as you said, are the documents actually that I have enough, or no, I have immediately to change it by now, because maybe my cycle is 1 year, so then I have to wait 1 year to make the new PMS PSUR report. So what's your advice now for people that have to hit the 16 June due date?
Yeah, so this frequency. So if you sort of take back the steps, so you need to be compliant by the 15th of June. That doesn't mean that you've got to produce a whole PMS report with the UK requirements. It depends on your certification cycle dates, and it depends on the risk class of your device. So now we're sort of starting to walk into some of the similar things with CE. For most manufacturers, their CE cycle will be running ahead of their UKCA cycle. So it's, if you've transitioned to the EU MDR, you've started from that date of transition. If you didn't transition, you started from, I forget the actual date of when the EU made it mandatory for the letter showing that the transition had started. I think it was April 2024.
Yeah, March,
thereabouts.
April, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. So your cycle's already started. So best practice, in my opinion, would be to update your processes, add the UK requirements, and then slot it in with your existing CE cycle. Just like CE PMS, the UK requires that it's continuous, so there's no gaps. You don't miss out particular gaps. You're following that data on a continuous period, and it just means that if you update your processes now, as you come to update your CE, you're adding in that UK content, and then you're sort of separating out the data in the way that MHRA can access it. So for class 3, you're expected to do annual. Active implants, it's annual, so those high risk devices, class 2B implants. For the lower risk devices, it's biannual. so every 2 years. And it's a case of looking at the risk class of your device to know when that document needs to be submitted to your UKRP, to your UK approved body. But there's no reason why you can't do it earlier.
Exactly, yeah. And for class one, it's when you want, or if there is any change. So
well, if you are self-declaring, it's I believe class one it's biannual. You'd have to again look at Sophia's blogs because she's gone into all the detail.
okay. So let's look at that. So now, if we want to be more practical and give some tips maybe to people on how to prepare for all this, so what will be your mainly way that you will give some idea, some ideas, if I can say, to avoid some pitfalls, if I can say, on all this. So what's your recommendation?
Avoiding those pitfalls.
Avoiding MHRA to give you a non-conformity, or avoiding an approved body to say you are wrong, etc. So what can we hammer on the head of people? Say, do it, do that. Hey, just a second. Do you need a EU, Swiss or UK representative? Then choose Easy Medical Device. We can represent you and also become your importer. Contact us at eo@easymedicaldevice.com.
Firstly, do your gap analysis. Really spend time there. If you get that right, everything else will flow afterwards. If you've got a UK approved body, talk to your UK approved body. I've heard certain UK approved bodies have produced specific guidance, how they want to see the PMS, or how they want it to be submitted. Different UK approved bodies have different processes. Some have got portals, some prefer you to go directly to them.
So you are saying now that each UK approved body has also its own requirements?
Not necessarily for the reporting.
Okay.
But for how you submit it. So with some UK approved bodies, like notified bodies, they've all got a slightly different way of working. So for some, you will have a single point of contact, and that will stay your single point of contact for your UCAB and your notified body. Others, it's a little bit more separated. Some will have an electronic portal where you're uploading the documents. Others, you have to email them to someone to check through. If you've not got a UK approved body and you're working with a UK responsible person, it's good practice to talk to that person in advance and say, when do you want it? How do you want it? Is there any specifics, so that you're making sure that you're meeting their requirements too. So MHRA have produced quite a lot of formats, so templates that you can then use to show your data. They've produced a lot of like templates on how to, so like tables, graphs, things like that, on how to actually present that data. It's up to you to choose the one that best reflects the type of data that you're producing. But it's a good practice to use those MHRA formats. And again, when I was talking about separating out and presenting the data in the right way so MHRA can access it, that is one aspect of how to do it. You need to select, as a manufacturer, you've got to select the most appropriate way of presenting data. It's good practice to provide a justification or explanation as to why you've selected that. One thing that we've seen an awful lot over the last really 5 years is high turnover in manufacturers of their quality management team. So if you've got someone doing the PMS report and then they move to a different role in the company or leave the company, you might not know why they have selected that format of presenting data. Really good practice to just keep that information so anyone reading really understands why you've done it that way. Pay attention to the dates for submission. Obviously they're slightly different. MHRA is more prescriptive.
What do you mean by date for submission? So what is there requirements here, or?
So obviously annual for those high-risk devices, biannual for the other devices, whether you're aligning it to your CE, whether you're aligning it to... So the latest date that you're going to be submitting is June 2026. But most people will be submitting it before, and it will be staggered over there. Make sure that you've got consecutive coverage in your PSURs, that you're not missing any dates. You really need to cover all of the data and keep it up to date. I think it's really helpful to provide a cover page. So on your PSUR, just have a summary of the things like the dates it's covering, the data it's covered, the geographic areas, and summarize the key points. So at a glance, whoever's reading it then knows what's going to follow in that report. The S, is a summary. We've seen PSURs for CE that have been like 800 pages.
Okay.
It's a summary. You're supposed to summarize the data. It should be clear and in a structured manner. Remember that you're paying someone to review this. So it helps if you invest and make it concise, clear, structured so that people can follow. I found it really good practice to use somebody in the team who's much more junior level to actually read through and ask questions to see if they really understand it. If they do, you're on the right track. Because
so just about the 800 pages that you are saying here, are we talking, for example, about raw data? We don't need raw data or those kind of things, or as you say, it's a summary, so I don't need to give you all the complaints one by one, what is inside, all the I don't know, the feedback from customers one by one. You want really a concise thing that can make 30 pages, for example, but no need for us to show you the raw data.
So you need to have, every manufacturer needs to have the raw data, and they need to have that data available so that the notified body, the approved body, all the regulators can dip in and they can actually see the concise trail of how you came to your conclusion. A summary report doesn't regurgitate the data. It references the data.
Yeah, exactly.
It analyzes the data, it summarizes the data. And, with the key thing to remember with these reports is your certification has been approved on a risk benefit analysis. And in that risk benefit analysis, you identified risks and you identified whether those risks, what frequency was acceptable to make sure that they meet the minimum safety and performance requirements. What we're looking at here is, has there been a change? Is there new information, a new risk that you didn't identify? Is there a new frequency to that risk? Is there a new trend emerging? And this is the whole purpose of PMS. So it's to alert you as the manufacturer to where perhaps you need to change your PMCF, perhaps you need to do an additional study, perhaps you need to collect more data. And for the regulator, it's to be alerted of any safety signals, any potential threat that's coming up in the future. So it's a way to communicate between the manufacturer to the regulator of any changes in that initial certification, and also make sure that the certification stays valid.
Exactly. Yeah.
So I think, if you can summarize it like that, with that sort of mindset, then that's what you need to be producing.
Okay. So I think it's covering mainly all my questions. So any last things that maybe you would advise people apart from read it now, because we have to read it now.
Well, so I suppose the sort of key points for me is it's applicable to all devices, even if you're CE. Make sure that you separate out the GB, the EU, and the rest of the world data so that it's accessible. So, we're now talking going from a 30-page document to a 33-page document. And just specifically address the GB requirements. So they're in the PMS legislation. Make sure you specifically address those requirements so you're staying compliant.
Okay. So anything else regarding DQS? So always the question that we are asking to notified bodies, do you have some slots and people can contact you for getting some certification, or no, you are really full and it's really a lot of projects already ongoing?
DQS is quite busy at the moment. We have quite a lot of projects underway. I mean, I won't say there's never no, I don't think any notified body is full. And I'll explain that that's because of the codes. Quite often you find you've got capacity in one code, you don't have capacity in another code. And it does tend to be quite similar. In my experience, it does tend to be quite similar across all notified bodies, because usually if you don't have capacity in a particular code, it's because there's an industry shortage of that skill rather than a specific notified body. But no notified body is going to say no to clients. And I think at the moment with the EU MDR extension, it's actually opened up quite a lot of capacity in a lot of different notified bodies. I'm seeing huge movement, and I think we're now beginning to see what we predicted with the EU MDR back 10 years ago, 10 years plus, and that is that we're going to see some much bigger organisations. There has to be growth in every notified body to be able to stay in that EU MDR space. So we're seeing some of the notified bodies already branding their new USP. I won't name names, but I've seen some really positive signals from some organizations where they're investing very heavily in medical devices. And I think that's great for the industry.
Yeah.
I'm also seeing a slight separation regarding innovation and the investment in innovative devices, which often takes more time and it's more costly. The margin's lower for notified bodies versus the sort of key clients and the established products where the margin tends to be a little bit higher. And it's just because a innovative device takes longer to get to market, so you're much longer before you get paid. So I think that's the sort of situation that I'm seeing.
So anyway, I will put all the details on the show notes so that people can contact you then maybe to also get some quotation from DQS. But yeah, I think for this topic of post-marketing surveillance, it's I think a first topic. I suppose there will be more that will come for, I don't know when. Is there an agenda now for the release of other modules? Or?
Yeah. So absolutely. So one of the things that I would say is the UK has gone through quite a lot of change. We've got a new government. We've got a new team at MHRA. They're managing the ABs. Our head of MHRA has recently retired. So we've got a new team. All the management structure has changed with MHRA. And I'm seeing a very different, much more pragmatic approach. And I probably said it previously here, but I've said this a lot in public. The EU market is 40% of global market for medical devices. And when you're a manufacturer and you're applying for CE, your price tag for CE is based on 40% global market access. The UK is 4%. So if you're putting a price tag on UKCA, it's got to be 10% of that CE price tag. But 5 years ago, we got it for free.
Yeah.
And so there's a natural hesitance even to pay 10% for manufacturers. And any barrier, any difference creates a barrier and it adds cost. And takes me back to many years ago, I was in a GHTF meeting at the World Health Organization, and they had people from all over the world, regulators from all over the world. And there were some regulators from a developing country, and I won't mention which, who said, to stop fraud, we're going to regulate everything. We want a approval for cotton wool. We want an approval for absolutely everything to prevent fraud. And a very, very wise woman from the US FDA stood up and said, every barrier, every difference that you make creates a barrier and increases the cost of products going onto your market. Now, the UK is now in that same situation. And, having been in Switzerland for many years and seeing how the Swiss approach it from a much more pragmatic way, where they recognize the Swiss market is so small, they cannot have an independent marking. TGA in Australia also have said that for a long time, that their market is too small to create barriers. And I think that the UK is perhaps coming round to that way of thinking of what does MHRA need? MHRA needs visibility on the products on the market, and they need the authority to be able to enforce. They don't have that at the moment with CE. However, if they insist on UKCA and adding on UKCA, they're going to limit the number of products that go on the market. So there's a very fine balance. So if I get my crystal ball out, what do I see in the future? I currently think we're in a 50-50 situation where with 50% that UKCA will align to the EU MDR and MHRA will insist on having UKCA so they get that visibility. However, I also see with the international reliance, particularly if MHRA gets access to the MDSAP, and they can then ask the manufacturers for the MDSAP reports, and they're starting using that as their compliance, that they wouldn't need to have everything with UKCA to get the visibility that they need in order to regulate the market.
Great.
So there are two, we really are at this sort of, I would say this crossroads where we've got two directions. And I would say manufacturers probably want the one that's lower cost and more accessible for them. I think it would be a shame to see no independent marking in the UK, because that takes away any UK only devices. It makes it more difficult to regulate those UK only devices, but we've got a lot of UK approved bodies. I don't think all of those UK approved bodies will stay in the game, because I don't think there's enough market for them. But you only need 2 or 3 UK approved bodies to meet that market demand. So real crossroads.
And I think a lot of manufacturers are choosing UK approved bodies that are also notified bodies, so that they can be having a bridge also between EU and UK, instead of having one for EU, one for UK, have one that can be global and facilitate also their work. So, but good. Let's see what will be happening in the near future, and I hope to have you again to maybe comment this situation and see where people have to go. But UK is changing. There are some changes that are happening, so we have also to change our documentation, change our practices, and and I will inform my team now that UK rep, we have also to do some work. So
absolutely produce a client information.
Exactly, let's do it.
Remind it's everybody's responsibility to really make sure that this message is going through, because I think there's a lot of misinformation. So it's really important to support manufacturers through this.
Exactly. Okay, so thank you, Claire. It was really, really appreciated. And again, for people, go to the show notes. I will place all the blog posts, all the things that the DQS team has prepared. And if you have any questions, just send us an email at info@easymedicaldevice.com, and we'll try otherwise to answer it, or create a new episode where we answer your questions again. So, okay, Claire, thank you very much, and I wish you a nice day.
Thanks, Munir. Speak to you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.